In the shadowy outskirts of Brackenridge, there stood a decaying manor, a remnant of forgotten opulence. It was within these crumbling walls that Silas Blackwood, the town's recluse, dwelled. Whispers of his dark arts floated through the town like the mist that often shrouded the manor. Some said Silas consorted with infernal forces, while others murmured of his grim experiments, resurrecting the dead from the nearby graveyard. The townsfolk steered clear, their hearts gripped by a dread they dared not name. One spring, a new family arrived, bringing with them a radiant daughter named Eveline. Her beauty captivated Silas, and he sought her favor with gifts, chalices of gleaming gold, necklaces strung with pearls, and a pot of ever-blooming roses. But Eveline's heart belonged to another, Elias, a charming young scholar returned from distant universities. A week after their first meeting, Eveline and Elias eloped, leaving Silas seething in his lonely manor. Upon their return, Eveline and Elias hosted a grand celebration, inviting all of Brackenridge. As Eveline twirled across the dance floor with her father, the night sky erupted in a cacophony of thunder. Lightning tore through the heavens, and with a deafening crash, the double doors of the ballroom burst open. A putrid wind howled in, carrying the scent of decay. There stood Silas, his eyes ablaze with a scarlet fury, followed by a procession of the dead. These cadaverous beings, their hollow eyes flickering with an eerie blue fire, filed into the room in grim silence. Two of the revenants seized Elias, dragging him before their master. Silas, his expression twisted with madness, drew a dagger with a blade of obsidian, and with a swift, brutal motion slashed Elias's throat. Eveline's scream echoed through the hall as she rushed to her dying love, heedless of the stench and the cold, grasping hands of the dead.
"Take my life too,"
she pleaded, her voice raw with despair. Silas, unmoved by her anguish, lifted Eveline from the blood-soaked floor and carried her out into the stormy night. The macabre parade of the dead trailed after them, the cacophony of the tempest fading as they vanished into the darkness. Desperate to rescue Eveline, her father and Elias's father rallied a mob. They stormed Silas's manor only to find it eerily empty. Floating orbs of light cast a ghostly glow in each room, but of Silas and his captive there was no sign. The search continued for days, but no trace was found. Elias was laid to rest in the town cemetery, and the ballroom, tainted by horror, was demolished. The townsfolk spoke of that night in hushed tones, dreading the fate of poor Eveline. A year passed, and on the anniversary of the grim ball, a faint knock sounded at Eveline's parents' door. Her father opened it to reveal a gaunt, spectral figure. It was Eveline, her eyes hollow with suffering. Her tongue had been severed, rendering her mute. From her tattered cloak, she produced an obsidian blade, its edge stained with dark, dried blood. The grim satisfaction in her eyes told a tale of vengeance completed. That night, Eveline passed away peacefully, a serene smile on her ravaged face. The tale of Silas Blackwood and the fate of Eveline became legend in Brackenridge, a dark story whispered to children to keep them from straying too close to the shadows. And the manor, now abandoned, stood as a silent sentinel, its secrets buried deep within its rotting walls. On a quiet suburban street in a sleepy English town, the Thompson family settled into their new home. The house was a charming Victorian with ivy-clad walls and a garden bursting with roses. It was everything they'd dreamed of. In the attic, among the dust-covered boxes and forgotten treasures, they discovered an old painting. The image of a young boy, his eyes filled with tears, his expression haunting, intrigued them. It was signed Giovanni Bragolin, a name that held little meaning to them. Margaret Thompson, a collector of antiques, was captivated by the painting's melancholic beauty. She decided to hang it in the living room above the mantelpiece. The boys' sorrowful eyes seemed to follow them as they moved about, but they dismissed it as a mere trick of the artist's skill. Little did they know, they had unwittingly invited a curse into their home. The Thompsons' peaceful life began to unravel shortly after the painting was hung. It started with small, unsettling occurrences. Objects would disappear and reappear in odd places. Doors creaked open on their own. At night, they heard faint sobbing, but when they checked on their children, Emily and Ben, they were sound asleep. One evening, as Margaret was preparing dinner, the stove suddenly ignited with a ferocity that sent flames licking up the walls. She managed to extinguish the fire before it caused significant damage. But the incident left her shaken. John Thompson, her husband, began to experience vivid nightmares. Each night he dreamed of the crying boy, his tears turning to blood, his mouth forming silent screams of agony. The children were not spared either. Emily, the youngest, would often wake up crying, saying she saw the boy in her room standing by her bed. Ben, usually a fearless teenager, began to avoid the living room altogether, claiming he felt a cold, oppressive presence there. Desperate for answers, Margaret began to research the painting. She discovered the legend of the crying boy, a mass-produced print by Giovanni Bragolin, the pseudonym of Italian painter Bruno Amadeo. According to urban legends, homes with this painting had an uncanny tendency to catch fire. Even more disturbing was the claim that while the houses burned to the ground, the painting itself would remain unscathed. Margaret's fear turned to terror when she read that the boy in the painting was said to have been an orphan who died in a fire, and that his spirit cursed the paintings. The more she learned, the more the pieces of their own experiences fell into place. The fires, the sobbing, the sense of dread, it all pointed to the painting. Determined to rid themselves of the curse, the Thompsons decided to destroy the painting. John took it to the backyard and tried to burn it, but the flames seemed to avoid the canvas, leaving it untouched. In desperation, he took a hammer to it, but the painting remained unmarked. It was as if the boy's sorrowful gaze had protected it from harm. That night, the family gathered in the living room, the painting still hanging ominously above the mantel. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with fear and uncertainty. Suddenly the lights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. The sobbing grew louder, filling the room with an otherworldly sorrow. A gust of icy wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles they had lit for comfort. In the dim light of the fireplace, the silhouette of the crying boy seemed to shift, his eyes glistening with malice. Emily screamed as a shadowy figure emerged from the painting, its form twisted and dark.
"Leave us alone!"
John shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. The figure moved closer, its presence cold and suffocating. Margaret clutched her children, her heart pounding. The boy's eyes seemed to bore into her soul, his tears falling like drops of ice. She felt an overwhelming sadness, a grief that was not her own.
Please,
She whispered, her voice trembling.
let us go.
In a moment of clarity, Margaret remembered the stories she had read. The curse was tied to the boy's sorrow, his unresolved pain. Summoning all her courage, she spoke to the spirit.
I'm sorry for what happened to you.
She said softly.
You didn't deserve it, but you can't stay here. You need to move on.
The figure paused, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. The sobbing ceased, replaced by a deep, echoing silence. The boy's eyes softened, his expression one of longing. Slowly, the shadow retreated, melding back into the painting. The room was still, the air heavy with a sense of release. The lights flickered back on, and the oppressive chill lifted. The painting remained, but the curse seemed to have been broken. The Thompsons removed the painting the next day, taking it far from their home and burying it deep in the forest, where it could harm no one else. The house returned to its peaceful state, the strange occurrences ceasing entirely. The Thompsons never spoke of the painting again, but the memory of those haunting eyes stayed with them. They had survived the curse of the crying boy, but the legend lived on, a cautionary tale for those who dared to disturb the sorrow of the past. Long ago, in the secluded Farrowbrook Abbey, nestled among ancient whispering pines, there resided a monk named Father Ambrose. Unlike his brethren, Ambrose harbored a twisted love for gold and power that eclipsed his devotion to God. His silver tongue and dark heart made him a master manipulator. In the dim light of the confessional, he listened to the sins of the parishioners with feigned piety, only to extort their gold and silver in exchange for silence. Publicly he condemned their transgressions, but in the shadows he fanned the flames of their wickedness. Ambrose's reign of terror continued unchecked until one fateful night when his cruelty reached its zenith. In a fit of rage, he beat an elderly woman to death, her cries echoing through the stone halls. The townspeople, driven to their breaking point, stormed the abbey and seized him. His trial was swift, and he was sentenced to hang for his heinous crimes. On the day of his execution, a grim crowd gathered beneath the gallows. As the noose tightened around his neck, Ambrose's eyes burned with malevolent defiance. The trapdoor released, and his body swung lifelessly. The villagers, believing justice had been served, turned away, but a chill ran through the air as an unholy transformation began. Before the horrified eyes of the onlookers, Ambrose's corpse writhed and convulsed. His face contorted, elongating grotesquely as small tusks erupted from his cheeks. His once white hair grew long and oily, and his mouth twisted into a malevolent grin, revealing sharp, pointed canines. His eyes snapped open, glowing a sinister yellow even in the bright light of midday. With a guttural growl, the creature that had once been Ambrose sprang to its feet, its hands now ending in razor-sharp claws. The villagers screamed and fled, their prayers falling on deaf ears. The Goblin monk, as he came to be known, vanished into the depths of the Farrowbrook forest, but he did not stay hidden for long. As night fell, the abbey's halls echoed with the blood-curdling screams of his former brethren. One by one, the monks who had condemned him were hunted down and slaughtered, their bodies found with expressions of sheer terror. After 5 monks had fallen to the Goblin monk's wrath, the remaining brothers abandoned Farrowbrook Abbey, fleeing to distant lands in a desperate bid for safety. The abbey, once a place of solace and prayer, was left to the elements. Ivy crept up its walls, and the roof caved in, the stone edifice slowly succumbing to ruin. Yet the legend of the Goblin monk endured. On moonless nights, when the wind whispered through the ancient pines, villagers claimed they could hear Ambrose's sinister laughter echoing from the depths of Farrowbrook Forest. The brave or the foolish who ventured too close to the abbey's ruins spoke of glowing yellow eyes watching from the shadows, and some never returned at all. To this day, Farrowbrook Abbey stands as a haunting reminder of Ambrose's insatiable greed and the dark power that corrupted his soul. The goblin monk remains a spectral guardian of his ill-gotten treasures, waiting for the next unwary soul to cross his path. And so, the tale of Farrowbrook Abbey is passed down through generations, a chilling cautionary tale of the dangers of avarice and the unyielding grip of evil. One evening, as twilight painted the sky with its melancholy hues, the phone rang with an urgency that set Rosie's heart racing. It was her dear friend, Isabella. Her voice trembled, broken by sobs, as she told Rosie about her husband Enrique leaving her. Their marriage was ending, and she was devastated. Rosie called her own husband, who was on a business trip in Chicago. He agreed that she should go stay with Isabella for a few days to support her through this difficult time. With his blessing, she packed a small suitcase and set off on the long drive to Santa Fe. The journey would take 4 hours, and she aimed to arrive around midnight. The dark highway stretched before her, slick with rain, reflecting the ghostly glow of her headlights. An unsettling chill crept over her, as if unseen eyes were watching. Rosie glanced repeatedly at the rearview mirror and into the back seat, but each time she saw nothing. Her nerves were frayed, and she longed to be home, safe in her bed. As she approached Santa Fe, Rosie turned off the main highway onto the winding side roads leading to Isabella's house. The rain had lessened to a fine mist, wrapping the world in an ethereal shroud. At a small crossroads, a figure suddenly stepped into the street. Rosie shrieked and slammed on the brakes, her heart pounding in her ears. The car skidded to a stop, and Rosie looked around frantically. There, just outside her window, stood a woman. Her face was contorted into a demonic visage, with glowing red eyes and jagged, sharp teeth. She leapt at the window, her clawed hands striking the glass. Rosie screamed and floored the accelerator, the car lurching forward. For a few harrowing moments, the woman kept pace, clawing at the window. Then she fell behind, but in the rearview mirror, Rosie saw her grow impossibly tall, towering over the road like a monstrous tree. Red mist swirled around her as she pointed after Rosie, her mouth moving silently. Rosie turned her attention back to the road, terrified of crashing. Rosie reached Isabella's house in record time and flung herself out of the car, pounding frantically on her door, glancing over her shoulder for any sign of the demon. Isabella rushed to the door and let her in.
"Shut the door! Shut it!"
Rosie cried, pushing past her into the safety of the house.
Rosie, what happened?
Isabella asked, her eyes wide with concern. She led Rosie to the living room, where she collapsed onto the couch, sobbing in fear and exhaustion. After a few minutes, Rosie managed to recount her terrifying encounter. Isabella gasped, her face paling.
Were you at a crossroads when you saw her?
Isabella asked urgently. Rosie nodded, bewildered by her question.
It must have been La Malhora.
Isabella said, wringing her hands.
La Malhora?
Rosie repeated, the words foreign and ominous.
Yes, the bad hour.
Isabella explained.
She appears at crossroads when someone is going to die?
Ordinarily, Rosie would have laughed at such a superstition, but the memory of the demon woman was too vivid, too real. Isabella made Rosie a cup of hot cocoa, brought her luggage in from the car, and sent her to bed. She was so concerned that she didn't even mention Enrique or the divorce. The next morning, Rosie felt better, but a creeping dread shadowed her thoughts. Neither of them spoke of La Malhora, but it lingered in the air between them. Rosie decided to return home and insisted on leaving in the daylight, too frightened to face the crossroads in the dark. Isabella insisted on accompanying her. They arrived at Rosie's house just before dusk. They hadn't been home more than 20 minutes when a police car pulled into the driveway. Rosie's heart sank, and Isabella's hand tightened around hers. The officers were gentle, but their words were like daggers. Rosie's husband had been mugged the previous night on his way back to his hotel after dinner. He had been shot in the head and died instantly. His body was discovered that morning. She lurks beneath the inky waters of the lake near Presque Isle, a phantom presence entwined with the shadows of the deep. Her form is lithe and serpentine, moving through the weeds and mire with a sinister grace. Skin pale as death and tinged with green, her yellow eyes glow luminously in the dark. Long, thin arms stretch out from her body, wrapping themselves around the unwary, while her foul green pointed teeth sink into soft flesh. Sharp nails at the ends of her bony fingers stroke you into the deepest, most eternal sleep. Known by many names, to the sailors of Lake Eerie, she is the Storm Hag. A malevolent sea witch, the Storm Hag is a sinister Jenny Green Teeth who conjures tempests and drags shipwrecked sailors into her wicked embrace, condemning them to an eternity beneath the lake's surface. She is a master of deception, often waiting until the calm after the storm to strike. When sailors relax their guard, believing the danger has passed, she erupts from the dark waters, spewing lightning and wind like venom, and the ship vanishes, never to be seen again. There is only one warning before she strikes. If you listen closely, you can hear her haunting song against the harsh wind and thrashing waves.
Come into the water, love. Dance beneath the waves, where dwell the bones of sailor lads inside my saffron cave.
If you hear this, flee immediately, for the Storm Hag is right beside you. If you cannot escape, then pray to your God for mercy, for the Storm Hag will grant you none. Her whirlpool will engulf your ship, and her long green arms will lovingly pull you into the depths, where she will feast on your body among the tangled weeds. This tale of the Storm Hag begins on a night that was thick with fog, the moon a mere sliver of silver hidden behind dark, roiling clouds. Captain Gideon Thorne stood at the helm of his ship, the Whispering Gale, his eyes narrowed against the mist. The waters of Lake Eerie were unusually calm after the violent storm they had just endured. The crew, weary and battered, began to relax, thinking the worst had passed.
Captain, all's quiet now,
said First Mate Lyle, his voice heavy with relief.
Shall we drop anchor for the night?
Gideon considered the suggestion, his instincts prickling with unease.
Aye, but keep a sharp lookout. These waters can be treacherous.
The crew moved to secure the ship, their movements slow and tired. As the anchor plunged into the dark depths, a strange, melodious sound drifted through the air. Gideon's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the eerie tune.
Come into the water, love. Dance beneath the waves, where dwell the bones of sailor lads inside my saffron cave.
To arms!
Gideon shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the sudden roar of wind and waves. The calm shattered, replaced by a fierce tempest that seemed to rise from the depths themselves. The crew scrambled, their faces pale with terror. From the water she emerged, the storm hag, her yellow eyes gleaming with malice, her mouth twisted into a wicked grin. Lightning crackled around her, illuminating her ghastly form. With a voice like the howling wind, she shrieked,
Your souls are mine!
The whispering gale was caught in her vortex, the ship spinning helplessly as the hag's long, green arms reached up, grabbing sailors and pulling them into the depths. Gideon fought to free himself, but her grip was iron, her touch as cold as the grave.
Captain?
Lyle screamed, just before the hag's claws dragged him underwater. Gideon managed one last desperate prayer before he too was pulled beneath the waves. The water closed over him, dark and suffocating. The hag's eyes were the last thing he saw, glowing in the blackness as her teeth sank into his flesh. When dawn broke, the lake was serene, the storm a distant memory. The whispering gale was gone, leaving no trace. Fishermen who ventured near Presque Isle whispered of the ghostly singing they heard in the night, a song that promised death to all who listened.
Come into the water, love. Dance beneath the waves, where dwell the bones of sailor lads. Inside my saffron cave.
The legend of the storm hag grew, a chilling tale passed down through generations of sailors. They knew that on nights when the storm clouds gathered and the waters lay still, her song could be heard, calling the unwary to their doom. And so they steered clear of Presque Isle, lest they too fall victim to the storm hag's insatiable hunger